interest in Vermont history, as many of you have, since you're here, have done as well. And tonight I'll be presenting, as the title suggests, the 14th Vermont Regiment, which was partially formed by volunteers from Addison County and from Middlebury, and East Middlebury in particular.
Sam, could you shut that light off?
Yes, sure.
Oh, much better. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. So just because of constraints of time and interest, I'm not going to pretend that this is going to be an exhaustive chronology of all the events that happened during the 14th service during the Civil War, or coverage of all the people and places that sort of shaped their service. If anyone is interested in that, there's a very good book by a man named Howard Coffin called 9 Months to Gettysuburg, which is available actually in the Vermont bookstore downtown. So I highly recommend you pick that up if you'd like to learn more about the 14th Vermont and the 2nd Vermont Brigade, of which it was a part. So in my own talk tonight, I want to focus on the lived experience of the men of the 14th. These men, on the whole, are not household names today, and they're generally buried in simple graves, either here in Vermont or far from home. These men were, in a very real sense, the same stock of our friends and neighbors. As I discovered during my research for this talk, a prior resident of 429 East Main Street, Austin Peck, was actually a corporal of Company E of the 14th Vermont and had served during their time of service. And that service, for the most part, was not one of glorious heroics, as we'll see. And as an account from their 1887 regimental reunion in Fairhaven relates, these soldiers were oftentimes fond of liquor and the occasional crude joke as anyone else of their time and condition. Yet when put to the test at Gettysburg, the 14th Vermont braved shot and shell to blunt Pickett's charge and help win the day for the Union Army. And it's the experience of the men behind this heroism that I want to explore tonight. In this task, we are helped by the fact that these Vermonters were part of a highly literate generation and had frequent opportunities for writing letters and diary entries to pass the time while on campaign. Two sources in particular have informed my presentation, and they are both thankfully out of copyright, so if you're interested, they are freely available online with a simple Google search. One is a series of letters to the Burlington Free Press by George Benedict, who was the paper's editor-in-chief at the time, and served in the 12th Vermont, sister regiment to the 14th. Also helpful has been a diary kept by J.C. Williams from Danby, who served in Company B of the 14th. Through these writings and other accounts that we have, we can get some feel for who these men were and the events they lived through. So with all that being said as a preamble, let's now turn to the history of the 14th Vermont, starting from its inception in the summer of 1862. At this point, nearly a year and a half into the Civil War, the cheery early predictions that the conflict would be settled after one short, glorious battle with a minimum of blood and suffering had been proven false. Bull Run, Shiloh, and most recently McClellan's failed Peninsula offensive against Richmond had by now made clear to all observers that North and South that this war was going to be a long and cruel one. The summer of 1862 was thus a time when both the Union and Confederacy were mobilizing all their resources for the struggle ahead. As part of this, in August of 1862, President Lincoln issued a call for 300,000 volunteers to enlist for 9 months' terms, hoping this additional manpower would succeed in ending the Southern Rebellion. Vermont had already answered the President's first call for volunteers a year earlier in 1861. Forming the 1st Vermont Brigade, which was already gaining praise for its courage under fire. Now the Union once again counted on the Green Mountain State to answer the call of duty. To fulfill this commitment, 5 new regiments of roughly 1,000 men apiece were formed, numbered from the 12th to the 16th. The 14th was recruited from the southwest of the state, taking in Addison, Rutland, and Bennington counties. And if you'd like to see the specific company, where each specific company was raised, here's a listing from the general area where each was recruited. Unlike in other states, where the failure to meet recruitment goals forced the imposition of a draft, all the Vermont regiments were filled by volunteers. Nor were these the stereotypical young farm boys looking for adventures that fill Civil War mythology today. Many of the officers and men were established in professional life and were already marked out for future success. As George Benedict reminisced later, from their number in the 2nd Vermont Brigade, in 25 years after the close of the war, 3 governors, 2 lieutenant governors, 2 judges of the Supreme Court, a congressman, a secretary of state, a United States district attorney, an adjutant general, a quartermaster general, 14 state senators, and many town representatives were selected. This tendency to professional competence was reflected in the officers of the 14th Vermont, who were on the whole men who knew their business. The commander, William Nichols of Rustlin, was at 23 years old already a veteran of several battles with the 1st Vermont Regiment. When his enlistment expired, Nichols had been elected to the Vermont House of Representatives before assigning to take command of the 14th. Similarly, his second-in-command, C.W. Rose of Middlebury, was at the age of 23 already a veteran of the 1st Vermont, having been wounded during the recent Peninsula Campaign. While not without their quirks, Nichols, for example, was known to ride while on the march with his pet chicken in his saddle. In the memory of their troops, both men are remembered as capable officers. With the officers selected, the 14th gathered at Brattleboro on October 6th of 1862. And so we have here a picture of Lieutenant Nichols on the left and what was supposed to be a picture of Brattleboro on the right, but which is apparently currently in the middle of a snowstorm, unfortunately. But so it goes. The next few weeks were filled with a routine of drill and guard duty until the regiment was officially mustered into service on October 21st. The next day, the men boarded the trains that would carry them south along the Connecticut River, the first part of their journey to the front. Arriving at New York City on the 23rd, the 14th was exposed to the first hardships of war, the food. New York provided provisions for all the arriving soldiers, which consisted of a stew, mixed of whatever ingredients that were had, and had apparently been left simmering for the better part of a week. This extra time cooking was not to the stew's advantage. Williams recorded in his journal seeing maggots swimming in it, and even 25 years later at the regiment's reunion, it was still a topic of not-so-fond reminiscence. Still, the men of the 14th endured this hardship, and after riding the rails through Philadelphia and Baltimore, arrived in Washington on October 26. Once arrived, the 14th and the other new Vermont regiments were formed into the 2nd Vermont Brigade and placed under the command of General Edward Stoughton, and on October 27th, officially made part of the 22nd Corps of the Union Army and assigned to the defense of Washington, D.C. There is an undertone of disappointment in contemporary reactions to this posting. While Washington, with its array of fortifications and huge garrisons, was about as well protected a position as could be found in the USA, it was also far from the front lines, and it seemed the men of the 14th would spend their enlistment quietly and far from battle. For the present, then, the 14th would spend their time serving under Uncle Sam in other ways than on the firing line. The men of the 2nd Brigade quickly adjusted to the routine of Army life as described by Benedict in one of his letters to the Free Press. Waking at daybreak for roll call, followed by breakfast at 7, consisting of an allotment of bread, pork or beef, and coffee, which also constituted the men's lunch at noon and dinner at 5. In between these meals, and up until the trumpet sounded the end of the day at 8:30 in the evening, the Vermonters were either at drill or at their various duties for the defense of Washington. At first, the 14th was given the duty of helping to construct and strengthen the line of forts that surrounded Washington, which also appears to be in a snowstorm. But if you have any sense of where the shape of Washington, D.C., the 14th was stationed just to the south of Alexandria, and there was a large fortification called Fort Lyon, named after a general who had died fighting for St. Louis. that they helped construct at that time. Then, on November 11th, just about 2 weeks after joining the Washington garrison, the 14th and the rest of the brigade were given a new assignment. Marched beyond the defensive forts ringing Washington, they were assigned the task of picketing the area around Fairfax Courthouse, about 20 miles from D.C. in Virginia. So if you can picture it, if you imagine Alexandria, just go about 20 miles to the west, and that's basically where Fairfax Courthouse is, more or less, midway between D.C. and Fredericksburg, Virginia, if you have any sense of that area. Fairfax was an important supply hub for Union operations in Virginia, and the Vermonters had the responsibility to see that this lifeline was not disrupted. To this end, the brigade was spread out on a 20-mile front along Bull Run and Occoquan Creek. To guard this length, each regiment would rotate its companies through 48 hours of picket duty, where the men would be strung along in small groups to provide advance warning of any rebel advance. Although the men of the 14th were far from the front lines, such isolated service still carried the risk of attack at the hands of John Mosby's infamous Rangers, who roamed the countryside of northern Virginia as a guerrilla band. Many times, the sleep of the regiment was disrupted as the men were rallied to the warnings of impending attack from nervous pickets. In nearly all cases, however, the looming rebels turned out to be shadows, local wildlife, local hunters, and, in one case, the brigade's commanding officer, who seems to have forgotten the password when challenged by his men. The Virginia weather proved a more challenging opponent, in particular during the winter. Whatever expectation the Green Mountaineers might have had about the sunny South, the winter months of their service brought cold and snow that were intense even by Vermont standards. The spring brought relief from the cold, but also a great deal of rain, which in an era with few paved roads and relying on transport by wagon, horseback, or foot, could make the journey of even a few miles an extended ordeal. The real danger for the 14th, however, and the one that depleted its ranks more than any bullet, was disease. Hardly a week goes by in Williams' journal that doesn't record either a death from illness or the confinement of a large percentage of the unit to the hospital as unfit for service. In some respects, the 14th was luckier than others of the Vermont regiments, as it mainly avoided service in the more malarial marshlands closer to the Potomac. Nevertheless, the ravages of smallpox in particular were so bad that the men of the 14th were all vaccinated against the disease in January 1863 at the government's orders.
No Kennedy then.
If he was serving in the Irish Brigade, probably. Yet despite all this, Army life was not without its entertainments. The men of the 14th were not immune to cards, dice, and the other vices of soldierly life, but the frequent mention of attendance at Sunday services perhaps showed that the regiment's character was on the whole more inclined to higher pursuits than these pastimes. In the spring of 1863, a band was formed from the musicians of the brigade, providing musical accompaniment to the evenings in camp. The unit's location also allowed soldiers on leave to indulge in a little tourism, either to the capital or to the battlefield of Bull Run. The main joy in camp life, however, as both Benedict and Williams relate in their writings, were the packages and letters from friends and family at home, both for news of those left behind, and also for the care packages of treats the soldiers received, allowing some relief from the monotony of Army rations. The 14th also seems to have quite enjoyed the recreational opportunities of life in the Virginia countryside, such as hunting, whittling pipes, and, weather permitting, regimental snowball fights, and was especially renowned for its skill in foraging, that is, making sure that local pigs or cows with suspected successionist tendencies received their appropriate punishment at the hands of the regimental cook. In this pursuit, the 14th was in a class of its own within the brigade. As the regiment's chaplain reminisced at their reunion, the boys of the regiment had once managed to carry off a church, brick by brick. Indeed, the common opinion around the campfire was that if the Army could just get the 14th close enough to Richmond, they could walk away with the rebel capital too. One other example of the 14th scrounging that still provoked mirth at their reunion was when the men were reported to have liberated a bottle of whiskey from the saddlebags of their brigade's commander, the aforementioned General Stoughton. Indeed, the reminiscences of the men of the 2nd Vermont are full of tales about Stoughton, and while many are funny, most are not fond. The general was certainly not without bravery. Stoughton had been appointed colonel of the 4th Vermont Regiment in the spring of 1861 at just the age of 23, and had fought through the battles of the Peninsula Campaign before being assigned to lead the brigade. Yet in the account of Benedict, Williams, and others, Stoughton seems out of step with the men under his command. He was, for instance, a stalwart Democrat among mainly solid Republicans. Indeed, while no supporter of secession, Stoughton had a contemptuous view of abolitionists as rebel-rousers, having said at a public meeting in the aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation that the Army should march on Congress to shoot these troublemakers. He was also, as Williams notes in his diary, a drinker and a curser beyond the limits of Vermont respectability. Finally, Stoughton was noted to be an enjoyer of the comforts of urban life, especially the company of attractive young ladies. The general frequently took leave to Washington in this pursuit, and it was rumored that he had situated his headquarters at Fairfax Courthouse, well away from the troops under his command, in order to court the debutante Antonia Ford, who resided there. Unfortunately for General Stoughton, Mrs. Ford also happened to be a spy for John Mosby and his band of Confederate guerrillas, and happily informed the rebel about her suitor's movements. On the night of March 8, 1863, Mosby and a group of just 20-odd partisans launched a raid on Fairfax Courthouse, using the sheer audacity of striking so far behind the front line as a cover to pass through the surrounding patrols and sentries. Arriving at Fairfax a little after midnight, Mosby and his compatriots rode up to the headquarters of the 2nd Vermont Brigade, finding it dead asleep, rousing the sleeping Stoughton out of bed and allowing him just enough dignity to change out of his pajamas